Welcome back to Missing. I am Tim here today with Lance. Lance, how are you today?
Doing fantastic per usual today. Hope everyone listening is doing fantastic as well. This episode was a last-minute decision. Is it fair to say that it was a last-minute decision to put it on the public feed? Maybe not last minute, but it was a decision that we made to put on the public feed. And I've made the decision recently to ask you how you're doing.
Thank you. I'm doing great. And yeah, we've decided to put this episode on the public feed to promote our subscription service. It's called Missing Premium. And for just $3 a month, you can get every single episode of Missing ad-free. But for $5 a month, you get every single episode of Missing ad-free plus our bonus show, which, along with Crawl Space, we're going to be doing one bonus show a week for this bonus feed. And you can access it at missing.supportingcast.fm.
And we do mention at the end of this episode that we're making changes to our subscription service. Don't want to take up too much time right now talking about that. Just make sure you keep your ears open at the end of this episode. But there are changes coming to it. We've been working a few months trying to figure out like the best way to deliver all this content. We think we got it. So just stay tuned in the upcoming months. We're going to have some exciting developments regarding the subscription service and what each tier is going to bring you. $2.99 a month. You said $3 a month. I think you're just making it easy to round up, but $2.99 a month. You overshot by a penny.
So what you're about to hear is our Hidden Opinions discussion, and Hidden Opinions is a show that we've done on Missing Premium for about 7 months now. We have 30 Hidden Opinions episodes up there, so you can scroll back and check those out once you subscribe. But we like to discuss some of our thoughts on the cases that we cover. And today's episode, we spoke about serial killer Christopher Wilder and our recent episodes on him.
And you said it really nicely before we recorded that this is almost like an epilogue to the episodes that we released about Christopher Wilder. And I'll just reiterate, we recorded this thinking it was going to be on the subscription feed. So this wasn't a decision made prior to recording. So you're getting like some really honest and colorful and raw opinions on a number of topics that came out of the Christopher Wilder conversation that we had when we recorded. It really left us all with a almost completely different mentality of how to look at people like Christopher Wilder, and also how the media treats people like that. And I don't know, I looked down at the recording, we were at 40 minutes, and I was like, this has been one of the best conversations you, myself, and Jen have had in a long time.
Yeah, absolutely. It was really great, and I hope everyone enjoys it. But Lance, before we throw it to the audio from our Missing subscription service, Missing Premium, I do want to mention a recent update on a missing persons case that we covered earlier this year. It was the disappearance of Jacob Dubois from Schertz, Texas. On September 14th, Schertz PD was notified that human remains were located and recovered within their jurisdiction, and they expedited the identification of the remains, and it was Jacob Dubois.
That's right, and Jacob Dubois was last seen on March 7th of 2021, and the person of interest in his disappearance, he was arrested for tampering with an investigation. Ethan Beckman is still incarcerated. It turns out we had some opinions on his disappearance, on Jacob's disappearance, and we thought that the police had worked him to the point where he had given up the location of the body. But based on the reports that have happened since, that doesn't seem to be the case at all. Seems like the body was found by individuals who have no connection to either parties, either Ethan or Jacob. But it's a development that's happened in a missing person case that we've talked about, so we will try to provide as many updates as possible as they come to us.
Absolutely, yeah, and Jacob's remains were found about 25 miles north of his home, and earlier this year we did speak with his mom, Sylvia, and Ethan's fiance, Holly, on Missing. And it is a very emotional interview and conversation, so definitely check out that episode, especially now that we have learned some more information about the case.
And our hearts really do go out to his family. It makes me think of Brandon Lawson's wife, Ladessa, when we were at CrimeCon, and she spoke to the crowd, and she said that they could go through the holiday season at least with something now after knowing that Brandon's body was found. So this just happened, right at the kickoff of the holiday season. So this will be the first holiday season that they go through with the knowledge about where and what happened to their son and their boyfriend and their friend. So that is definitely going to be a bittersweet time for them, and any support that you can show them, whether it's comments on YouTube or anything on social media to support them, please feel free to do so.
And the official word into murder charges is it's ongoing. That is the official quote. The investigation into the murder charges is ongoing. So we'll wait for word on that. All right, everyone. Thanks a lot for listening. Please follow us on social media at Missing CSM and check out our subscription service at missing.supportingcast.fm. Welcome back to Hidden Opinions. I am Tim, here today with Jennifer Amell and Lancifer Reenstierna.
Lance and I were just talking about at Obsessed Fest that we hated those intros that you do, Tim.
Yeah, I'm not surprised.
That's why we're gonna keep doing them.
Yeah, do you think I do them because I think you enjoy them?
It's for torture.
It's to get a reaction at the beginning of the show.
Oh, yeah, that's fair.
I think I would prefer it if Jen was Amell Sterna. That feels better to me.
Well, I'll try to keep changing it up, yeah.
It really does keep you on your toes. Because what else are you going to do? Be like, hey, I'm good. Thanks.
Yeah, I don't know. I try to come with a certain energy to start the show off,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And we are recording this on Friday, October 14th, 2022. We released a couple episodes this week about serial killer Christopher Wilder. As far as the content of those episodes, I'm not sure we held back a lot. Other than like calling him names and things like that, which we can do. I think I called him an asshole in one of those episodes.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we can keep doing that. Or, I mean, we can just get into sort of other issues that have popped up over the week and things like that. But definitely go check out those episodes. I think they're really good. It is a wild story that you should hear.
Mm-hmm. No pun intended.
It's tough to talk about Christopher Wilder and all of the horrific things that he did and not use the word wild. Like, it's very unfortunate that we have to do that, but what he did was bonkers. And you brought up, like, you called him an asshole, and we can call him names. And that's something that's been coming up recently. And I like using this platform on Hidden Opinions to talk about these topics that come up with other content creators. And we were just recently talking about using the word monster and using the word asshole, and how, like, using the word monster or evil for somebody, like you could easily do for Christopher Wilder, takes away from the actual deeds, the actual crimes that they've committed, because you've made them into, and I blame Thomas Harris for this, by inventing Hannibal Lecter. He invented like a cool serial killer, and I'm kind of being tongue-in-cheek here, but people think about that, and they think about that type of personality, and it doesn't exist. That's a hybrid of the way people in the media perceived a few different serial killers at the time. So he came up with this character, and these people aren't characters. They're like the most vile forms of a living organism that you can imagine. And it's just fun to have. We were talking with Chelsea Weber-Smith from American Hysteria about using the evil and monster, and it's interesting.
Yeah, it dehumanizes them to a point where I think it makes it easier for us to talk about this person if we think they're not like us. But that's not true. They are like us. They have blood. They have a heart that beats. They just have different desires than us. I think it's a very rare thing for someone to act like that. And it's even more rare for a serial killer to be like Hannibal Lecter, and they're like buttoned up, and they're not like batshit crazy in the other side of their life.
Yeah, like totally reserved and polite.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. Or particularly intelligent either. There's definitely that trope of like this, like, evil genius plotting out his next murder,
But most of them are just like, like dirty, unshaven idiots walking around who got lucky are impulsive, and people are probably afraid to talk about them to the authorities.
Yeah, totally. I think that's a great word to describe Chris Wilder. Impulsive. Everything he did was on complete impulse. There was no thought to like, oh, I might get caught, or definitely no thought to the suffering of the women he murdered, of course. But yeah, it's an interesting question, like why we're driven to not villainize, but think of these serial killers as like pure evil, like walking demons and stuff. And I think maybe it's like an attempt to try to understand it, because it's like the way we tell stories, we break things down into binaries, right? Like good and evil. And it's like, if you're good, you don't murder people. There's no room for nuance in that discussion. It's like easier to digest in a way. But the truth of the matter is that Chris Wilder like had a business. Like we touched on this a lot in the episode, Lance. You kept saying you were so surprised that this man could like commit these heinous acts and then also have a seemingly normal life on the other side of it. And yeah, it's crazy that those two things can exist at the same time.
I was thinking about this after we recorded, that you were how surprised you were at how surprised I was. And then I realized I wasn't really surprised that happened. I think I was surprised at how surprised I was. I think that's where a lot of that I think that's where a lot of it came from, because like I couldn't get past the fact, and the three of us here, have a company. We run it. We know how hard it is to do. And we know it takes a lot of focus and most of the energy that we have on a daily basis. And I just can't imagine at like 9 p.m. being like, to my partner, hey, I'm going to go to the gym. And that's the ruse that I use, and then I have this completely batshit life where I'm doing the most horrendous acts, like gluing people's eyes shut and strangling them. And then the next morning, what? I'm doing the books? Like I'm crunching the numbers?
Trying to find the Ohio unemployment number.
If anyone can find the Ohio unemployment number, forward it to me, please. For God's sake.
Yeah. No, I definitely understand what you're saying. It does seem confusing that he could actually run a business and have that lifestyle. We've definitely seen some killers who can sort of like we mentioned BTK, I think briefly in the episode. Like he was a guy who had a family, and I think with Wilder in his case, like he was doing bad stuff. He was raping and probably killing like earlier than his crime spree. But for him to have like run a successful business and then just snap, and he hit some point of no return, that I think is the most interesting part for me, because like with someone like BTK, he would have probably kept on doing what he was doing, having his family life on one side and having his murder on the other side, if he didn't get caught. But Wilder, that didn't happen with him. He was one of those people who ran a successful business and had a life, but then was a killer. But at some point, both, like, it didn't matter. Like, the other life didn't matter to him. He wasn't trying to do anything with that. He didn't care about it. He just was on this mission to abduct and kill as many women as possible and to go out with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was a definite, like, escalation period up to that point where he just snapped and, like, did whatever the fuck he wanted. I'm thinking of Jeffrey Dahmer, too. There's probably other serial killers that have gone through this, like, period of escalation up to a point where like nothing else matters except the compulsion. It's like Dahmer spent years like trying to, in his own words, trying to bury this compulsion, and it would like come out with a few victims here and there, or he would, move to just drugging men, and then it escalated to murder, and then there was a period of time where it was like a mere week between victims, and then mere days between victims. And that's what we're seeing with Wilder too. It's just like, who gives a fuck? Like, I've already, gone into the abyss.
Right. And he's not even giving a shit whether or not he gets caught, because he's leaving his ID at motels when he's checking in. So he's not even thinking about repercussions. And he's got a very fatalistic view of the whole thing, knowing that he's going to be taken out, because he tells the captive person that he had with him that he didn't want her with him when he died. So he knew something was going to happen.
What about Alan Legier? That's someone that comes to mind that was on that mission, it seemed like, to just die too. Like he was the guy that Jordan Bonaparte covered on the Nighttime podcast. We
right.
spoke to him about, and he was like stalking the woods of this small Canadian town and just like killing like elderly people in their house. It was wild. And like he never, he didn't care about another life. He was just on this path, and then he got arrested, and then he escaped. I think he I don't know, did some crazy tactics to get out of prison, and then started the whole thing over again.
Yeah, I gotta revisit that. Right. What did he do to
The
escape?
monster of the Miramichi. It was something with urine, right? I think he escaped during prison transportation to the hospital for an ear infection that he gave himself by depositing his own urine into his ear.
Are we talking about just the difference between organized serial killers and disorganized serial killers?
I think so. That's kind of what we're getting at, right? A little in a way.
Yeah, like Keyes, Ridgway, those were organized. They probably would have gotten away with it as long as they wanted to. Because I think on some level, Keyes probably wanted to get caught. Because they don't make stupid mistakes. They've never made stupid mistakes prior to that. So maybe on some subconscious level, they wanted the notoriety. I don't know. I'm just like, I do not have any degree in what I'm talking about.
No, we should have Marianne White.
Yeah, that's a good
John
call.
Philpin on
good
here.
call. Yeah.
Yeah.
But speaking of John Philpin, that brings us to Jane and back to the whole applying a moniker to people who are doing bad things. And she called her attacker an asshole. And we talked to her about
monster,
that.
Many
and
times.
a monster.
Yeah.
But she wrapped it up really nice when she said that great line to you, Jen, that Michael Nicolau was a bad man, but not my bad man.
Mm-hmm.
And that's like, there you go. Like that is almost spot on with what these people are. This who attacked Jane is a bad man. Michael Nicolau is a bad man. I think asshole's okay to say, but
Yeah.
Once you start getting into that like supernatural aspect of it,
Yeah.
the things that don't exist, like monsters and evil and demons and stuff.
Yeah, there's almost this like compulsion to turn them into paranormal entities, right? It's like turn them into boogeymen,
Yeah, you won't hear us doing that on this show at this point. Maybe in the past we did that, but we definitely I definitely make a conscious effort to not say that.
I used to say monster all the time.
Or evil. Yeah. I mean, I'm sure I used to too. Here in this Alan Legier thing I'm looking at, he was called the monster of Miramichi.
Yeah.
I think it's a human thing to make it easier to try to make sense of in your own head.
And definitely a media thing like that.
Oh,
like
for
the
sure.
media is definitely charged mostly with making up nicknames for these serial killers.
Right.
Because it's great on a headline and it grabs attention and stokes fear in people. Like nothing sells better than fear.
The beauty queen killer does not stoke fear. It's not salacious, and it's not to sell headlines, sell papers.
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
So that was Christopher Wilder, by the way.
Yeah.
in case-
On that note, though, John Philpin, he's a decorated criminal profiler, forensic psychologist who worked on the Connecticut River Valley cases. But it's interesting. So he's spent his life like trying to enter the mind of a serial killer in order to develop his psychological profiles to help catch these killers. But interestingly, because he has to in some way empathize with these killers, he doesn't think of them as monsters. In fact, like it rubs him the wrong way when we call these people monsters. He said it in relation to Jane. Like, of course, he understands why she does that and thinks that way, but like for what he does for a living, he can't think in those like binary terms. Found that interesting.
Absolutely. I mean, they're not going into a cave at night that leads to hell. They're going home. They're going to sleep.
Mm-hmm.
he wouldn't be doing his job correctly if he was categorizing them as a ethereal entity before even identifying them as a human being.
Yeah, I mean, John's definitely a man who's interested in like the fringes of society, like before.
Well, he lives in a lighthouse.
He does live in a lighthouse. Just kidding, he doesn't. Yeah, well, before he was a profiler, he would work with male sex offenders, like the worst of the worst, the people that we like to write off as just too deranged and damaged to function in society. And he made it his mission to try and help these people, to rehabilitate them. And I'm not sure what his thoughts on if that's possible. But yeah, it's an interesting place to go psychologically.
Yeah.
And it seems like he's led a tough life because of it.
Yeah, well, people do things for a reason, right? I mean, figuring out why a serial killer has a compulsion to kill is definitely an elastic ball of mysteries. Like, they probably don't know, but like there's some impulse there that's driving them to do it. Like we do things that we're doing things for a reason all the time, every day. Everybody is, like a serial killer whose heart is beating is doing it for some purpose for themselves,
Yeah, and maybe like I'm thinking about. So I finished the Dahmer series, the dramatized version on Netflix, which I know there's been a lot of feelings about, and I too felt like conflicted watching it. I thought it was a good series, that it was well made, and the guy who played, what's his name, Evan Peters. Yeah, Evan Peters. I thought he was great in it and stuff. But it's like the families of the victims are all over social media being like, this is salacious, this is re-traumatizing, we didn't sign off on this, they didn't need our permission to do this. Like, they're really, really against it. And so it's like, I think because we do what we do, like, you're always questioning like what the ethical line is, like, and especially with this Chris Wilder case, because it's not a normal thing that we cover, especially on Missing, But I was thinking, it's like these serial killers thrive on fear, right? Especially Wilder. It's like he had the one victim who he ended up not killing because maybe she didn't respond to him in the right way, didn't show him that fear, that fix of fear that he needed. So maybe like on a like grander level, on a societal level, like we need to keep revisiting these stories. We need to keep dramatizing it. We need to keep making documentaries and talking about it on podcasts to dispel that fear. And maybe that's the function of it, and not just like, being morbidly curious.
It's a really good point. I mean, it's like rewriting history or not rewriting history, or paying attention to history in all categories. And this is part of history. And it makes me think about, again, John Philpin, his work with Gary Schaefer in the same area, and he did the profile that caught him. And then it probably felt like to him, because he did that successfully, he would be able to do that with the River Valley killings, and it didn't happen. So he's using his past experience to try to make something, to put the pieces together for something else later on. So it's kind of like in line with what you're saying. If we start forgetting about these things, if we don't dramatize them, if we don't put docuseries out there and podcasts out there, then it's just left to that monsterization of them. Right. And that fictionalization of them.
And a growing fear. Right?
And a growing fear. Because it's because the snowball rolling down the hill just keeps getting bigger.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. And I think like at the end of the Dahmer series, I mean, you could definitely make the argument like that the filmmaker was trying to humanize Dahmer and like make you feel something for him, like, oh, what a tough childhood he had, he was damaged, he was sick, he was blah blah blah, which is true to some degree. I get how sickening that would be for like a victim's family and stuff, but like the function of that, like at the end of that series, you're like, okay, Dahmer was a full human being, he did terrible things, but he was also, what emerges, my point is what emerges is that Dahmer was like just weak and sick and not a monster, like not something to be feared generally. Does that make sense?
Totally. I mean, as evidenced by what they did to him in prison. Mm-hmm. Like, he's a human being and was capable of being murdered.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program. I suppose other people have impulses to kill and don't, and so I think to your point, those would be people with more inner strength than he showed or he had.
Yeah.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. It's interesting to look at it like that. Like this is a weakness, in that person, and it's obviously awful.
Yeah.
Right. And we're going to give ourselves degrees in this by the time we're done this episode, because we talked a lot about like Christopher Wilder and why he did what he did. And a lot of it was obviously about power and dominating somebody. And why would you want to dominate somebody in such a way? Because you're trying to fill a weakness in yourself, because you're sick of being the one that, or you're, hyper aware that you have this weakness in yourself.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you fix that? You dominate someone else.
Right. And you give into it so easily, and it becomes like easier and easier until you arrive at something like Wilder did and like drive cross country on this like rampage, That's like just weakness.
And Wilder had some court-appointed like therapy sessions, and one where him and the therapist were apparently talking about some murders that he did commit. But we didn't know in the episode like who brought that up. But I am very interested in that, and I do think that there's something in there that's when he like lost it, like he was able to control his impulses for most of his life. I know he had some rapes and murders in the past to get him to that therapist's office, but he was there, so he was trying on a certain level. But then I think there was a point where he was like, I just don't want that. Like, I don't want to have to try that hard to be something that I'm not. I'd rather give in and then just go out.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah. If you think about it on like a smaller scale, like we go through those things daily. It's like, well, I wish I could sleep better. Well, what will help you sleep better is like getting off of your phone. Yeah. Meditation. Or would get, there's all these practices. Like you could take a shower before bed. You can, turn the lights off. You can like get yourself into a state. But those are all behavioral practices that are like hard to implement, So if you scale that up into a life or death sort of situation, the principle remains the same. It's just hard, and they're too weak and don't have enough like empathy for other people to want to do that work,
Shit, I'm going to need a nap after this. A lot of thinking.
Getting to the bottom of
intense.
I mean, it's other than the weakness part, it reminds me of people who are in AA, people who are alcoholics who are trying to stop drinking, and that takes so much work. And it's a disease, which I don't know if that is like very comparable to being a serial killer, it being a disease, but right? I mean, it's like, but there's something that's going on in both of those brains that is not allowing them or allowing them to do or not do certain things. And it takes a lot of work to do the thing that makes you better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And when you don't have empathy, then you're fucked. I mean, if you're trying to not kill people and you don't have empathy,
yeah, you're not going to try that hard. You're not going to see
there's
the
no
other
reason
side of
for
that.
you.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're not going to see why that's a bad thing, or understand it really.
If I'm walking Eric and like he is like lollygagging and I give him a little pull, like, come on, I'm like, oh, I feel so bad. Like that is something that makes me feel bad because I'm not even abusing. Like it's just a little tug. And I'm like, oh, I'm sorry. Like if imagine like walking through life and not having like anything.
That's a really important point to note, because there was a really interesting article written by a psychologist who was a self-professed sociopath, like, which is maybe a little worrying, but like interesting, because she was saying it's like, hey, I was not born knowing how to empathize, like, but I can learn. I can like learn strategies that it's not necessarily like, oh, I feel what you're feeling in the sense that, most other people feel the things, but they give themselves rules to follow to function in society. So it is possible to learn skill sets that replicate empathy. It's not that it's impossible,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's so many sociopaths like walking around living normal lives, fucking CEOs, billionaires, like.
Oh yeah. World leaders.
World leaders, yeah. In some sense, like if you're going to do things on grand scales, you can't be like, twisted up about every little action, every little step you take. So there's, I guess, function for sociopaths and stuff, but it doesn't necessarily have to be like, well, sociopaths commit murder,
Right. No, sociopaths can inspire people though,
Sure.
and that's bizarre to me because it's like, yeah, you wouldn't get to that position of power unless you have this like belief that you can get from other people. Like you could just show some kind of confidence that gets other people behind you,
Yeah.
Yeah, like L. Ron Hubbard.
Yeah.
Like any founder of a religion, you need to come with that character trait that is inspiring others and showing that like what I'm saying is worth following.
You should tweet that, Lance. All religious leaders are sociopaths. We're going to get shot.
I realize I've said a lot of things during this that could be taken in various ways.
It's like difficult talking about such a taboo subject, It's like we're made to feel guilty for being so interested in like the dark recesses of, society, like serial killers and stuff. But true crime is massive. Like the Dahmer series was #1 on Netflix for like the minute it came out. Like people are fascinated. I don't know if guilt is a really helpful thing there. So I think it's worth talking about and worth unpacking.
That's an interesting point, yeah.
We struggle with titling this episode. We had these episodes. We had a conversation about it, and we really couldn't figure out anything but serial killer Christopher Wilder to call it. Like if we just called it Christopher Wilder, it would have looked like, oh, this guy named Christopher Wilder is missing, but that's not what it is. So, and you can't just call him killer. I suppose we could have, but I think serial killer was more fitting. But we had a whole conversation about it, like one thing we definitely wouldn't have called him or the episodes were the beauty pageant or the beauty queen killer.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm sure, and we did talk about it on the episode, and I'm sure people were wondering why we did that on Missing. And once again, I'm thinking about the profiles that are written on these cases and how you have to reference back to previous ones to see a pattern in a new one. And this is a good example of that. I mean, these women were missing at one point, and the circumstances may or may not be the same as another one that we've covered. So then you should be able to branch off from ones that are similar or dissimilar, if that makes any sense.
Mm-hmm.
If you're looking at someone else, if you're looking into another disappearance, like we just covered Elliot Scott Roberts, and there was no information on him, absolutely no information. So maybe there's a case 20 years ago where middle-aged men were being murdered by, a spree killer or something. I'm just saying, like, there's elements to each one that you can look at and say, oh, this one's similar. There's a railroad track. This is a small town in Tennessee.
Yeah, I don't see how learning about other cases is a bad thing. And there's still some missing victims of his that, current missing people.
Exactly.
Out there. Yeah. And as you mentioned, some of these cases or most of the murder cases, these women were missing at one point. So we're looking at it from a solved perspective, as in these cases were solved. How did we get here? And how can this inform us on our unsolved work? Because a case like you mentioned, Elliot Scott Roberts, has like no information on it. How are you even going to begin to figure out what happened to him if you don't have any idea of other missing persons cases? How
it's a great example.
Yeah.
That are solved. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and even
totally.
just missing people, Yeah. But you do learn a lot more when they're solved, you do.
Yeah. Pattern finding is really important in this kind of work.
Question for the both of you, and I'm just coming off the top of my head with this one. Do you think there's a difference between unsolved, unresolved, solved, and resolved? Because we're saying solved, case closed. That in my head is case closed.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Resolved means we got an answer, but it's really not. It's not all of the. I's dotted and T's crossed on this one.
Like, say you have a missing person and you find their remains, but you don't know what happened.
Missing resolved,
Mm-hmm.
but case not solved.
Right. Like,
Right.
we don't know the why.
Right. Yeah. Okay, good. There it is. Yeah. The one you know the why, the other one you don't.
Mm-hmm. Or the how, maybe.
Or the
Yeah,
how.
it would be how and not necessarily why, maybe, but yeah, at least how.
So there's gray to resolved
Yeah.
and unresolved. Yeah.
But I think they are different. They mean different things, I think, in what we're
Especially
doing.
in this case, right? Or especially in this, like, what we do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, his victims that were found murdered, those cases are solved. They didn't really get judiciously resolved in any way, So I'm sure the families of those victims don't feel like that was resolved, really,
Yeah, what an anticlimax for the families, like,
Yeah.
for him to take his own life in that manner. Yeah, he's just, prohibiting the families from getting their day in court and saying their piece and getting justice that way. I mean, but who knows? I don't pretend to speak for the victims' families. Maybe they're like, good, he's dead. Can't do it anymore.
Right.
I mean, we've heard similar things,
Mm-hmm.
especially with your work on Dark Valley, Jen. Like, some family members have a very specific life that is not related to the past tragedy anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, actually, Jane and I were just talking about that the other night on the phone because she couldn't understand the reaction of another victim's sister, and that she didn't want or didn't think it was important for people to understand the personality of her sister and like to humanize her sister who was murdered. And Jane was just like, well, why not? Like, if that was my sister, I would totally want everybody, I would shout it from the rooftops, It's like this, that she lived, that she had a life, that it mattered. Whereas this other person deals with their grief much differently. And I wonder, I mean, you can't make any judgments on what's healthier, but she was
No,
like...
I think we should go through it. Who was right? Who was wrong?
Yeah, right. Well, yeah, I mean, she was like, her point was like, those who knew her, and those who don't will never know her. And
Yeah.
that's just the way it has to stay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's valid. It's, all these ways of dealing with the idea of vengeance and closure, and, they're all valid.
And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program. During the recording of those episodes about Christopher Wilder, we had some conversations about which words to use, which I think is important, especially when you're looking at this guy who is gone now, and most of those cases are solved. There are still some unresolved ones and still some unsolved victims of his.
I see a trend. So happy I brought it up.
But I think we debated like certain details of the case and is there value in using these words or putting this visual out there to our listeners?
Yeah, it was a really important kind of talk we had beforehand.
Mm-hmm.
So Wilder, trigger warning when I use the R word, but Wilder raped a lot of the women, most of the women he then murdered. And then he also tortured them too. And Lance, I think you brought up the point that it would be a disservice to what these women went through to not say what they went through, which I agree with. Like, we have a tendency to want to like sugarcoat things in a way. And I think that impulse comes out of like wanting to protect our listeners, like because we care about them so much and we don't want to jar them or trigger them or, make them hate us.
Yeah. Yeah, and this was such a different kind of couple episodes that we did too than what we normally do.
Mm-hmm.
So I know I was a little protective about some of the words and some of the details, like gluing victims' eyeballs shut, like, or eyelids shut. Like I wasn't sure if all those details were necessary to put out there.
Mm-hmm. And you might be right. I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know what exactly was the right thing to do in that situation. But I had some feelings about the word rape.
Yeah.
Which I shared with you, Tim. I know it's a scary word. It's a triggering word. It's a loaded word. But I had read somewhere, forget where it was. but it's the aversion to the word rape itself is a male aversion to it because it's too difficult to take emotionally. Whereas women who do the majority of the experiencing of rape had to get comfortable with that word and don't want you to like try to smooth it over with it like sexual assault in some way. So that word is a powerful word to use and appropriate in some situations.
Yeah, once you told me that, like, honestly, and like, because I think I was trying to be protective, and I know we have mostly female listeners, and I was trying to not jar them or trigger them, but once you said it, I understood, and I can use that word. It's not even really triggering to me. It was really more about how I felt the listeners were going to take it.
Yeah, but in the same sense, like you just said it, you were trying to protect the women. Mm-hmm. Well, it's like, well, the women have probably already experienced it in some way or know another woman who's experienced it. So like, is it yours to protect them from, right? Or is it yours to say like, hey, I recognize that this happens?
Yeah.
I don't know. It's difficult.
It reminds me of what Nikki Bell had said when we did the live show with her in Worcester, and she was a former sex worker, but she's like, I don't use that. I'm a prostitute. Like, there's no reason to call it work. None of these women got into this, at least in her experience, saying like, this is the occupation that I'm going to now have for, like, this is my profession. Like, to make it into a profession,
like
sex work. Yeah, like it was a choice. Most of the women did not make that choice. They got into it out of necessity or they were forced. And to call it anything else is just... sugarcoating. Look, what's the other term aside from sugarcoating?
What?
Like,
I don't know. But that
diminishing it.
That issue is a big deal out there. Like, people have, if you were to tweet, I'm not going to use sex worker anymore. I'm only going to call prostitutes on the podcast. If you were to tweet that out there, the backlash that you would get would be insane.
Let's try. I'll do it right after my religious leaders are psychopaths tweet.
But you're getting that from someone who actually did that.
Yep.
So how are you being unethical about that?
It's not even like secondhand. It's a woman who now runs a couple of shelter homes for former sex workers, former prostitutes, and to get them off the street. And so, I mean, it's, someone who's a podcaster who doesn't have that experience calling out, I just might do it just to see what happens. Because what would be the other reaction if someone like Nikki Bell, I don't know if she's on Twitter, but if someone like her who went through it sees that and then responds to me and says, I support that, what's the trade-off?
I think much like anything on Twitter or just the internet, like, you're going to find things that back up your side no matter what,
40 minutes in and we're going to talk about You're totally right. Yeah. People are waiting on Twitter for something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I told you guys my story about working at the newspaper, but I'll tell it here. So before I worked for you guys, I was a reporter for an LGBTQ newspaper in Philadelphia. And you think it's hard just being a normal person and using language in a very deliberate way. It's like when you're writing about the queer community, like, they're understandably sensitive to information, to the language that you use. And my editor at the time was like super left, like definitely more left than I am. And I'm definitely like liberal. So I was doing a piece on sex work and, women in North Philly who were participating in sex work and like, some organization that they were forming. And one person that I interviewed had the same thing to say as Nikki Bell did. She's like, don't call me a sex worker. Call me a prostitute. Call me a former prostitute. Because I didn't choose this work, quote unquote. And like, that's not my life and it's not the word I want to use. So I wrote it, brought it to my editor, and she was like, you can't use that word. I was like, but yes, I can, because it's true. Like, who's more woke than who? Like, do you get to speak for this woman whose experience and tell her experience is invalid? Or like, it's a crazy, crazy thing that's happening.
It's a woke off.
It's a woke off. Yeah.
It's a woke off.
Well, that is funny. Like, all the people who have told us what to say and how to, like, what term to apply to, we'll just use prostitution, sex work, we'll use that for this example, probably have never done it. And the ones who have done it, in your example, my example, our example, they have been a part of it, and they've told us that's not what we want. But why aren't we listening to them?
Yeah, I don't know. It's like in this like, battle to not offend anyone, you are offending someone.
Yeah, you're
Regardless of what
inevitably
you do.
offending someone.
But are we learning? Are the people that we're offending, are they providing any sort of like positive education?
I don't know, man. Hard to say blanket, like in blanket terms.
I know. It's tough.
Yeah. I would say in the examples that you and I brought up, it's like these women who have had the experience that we're commenting on. Like, obviously, I, as the writer, I mean, I don't know if I need to say it, but I've never been a prostitute. But, like, I don't have that experience. And so you should let the person who had the experience kind of dictate how you talk about it. And, the thing I love about you two, Tim and Lance, is that, like, you guys listen if you're wrong and try to change. And I think that's the most important thing that you can do in this position behind the microphone.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I agree.
Yeah. I think if any of us consider ourselves the smartest people in the room, then we have a serious problem.
Uh-oh.
All right. Well, this has been a spirited chat here on Hidden Opinions, our missing subscription service show. Do you guys have anything else?
I just have one more thing. We are going to be making some wonderful changes to the subscription service. We had a meeting with our partners at Glassbox yesterday. We wanted to make sure that everyone got as much information and as much content as they can out of the monthly fee that they spend for this. And we also have our Crawl Space show, so we're talking about ways to bring those together. That'll be coming soon. But there's some really cool things that we're going to be doing on the higher tier, which it really isn't even that expensive. But we're going to make an announcement soon, so stay tuned for that. I really couldn't be more excited about this subscription service. We've tried to do subscription services since we started, and we just didn't find that right foothold. But we have a couple of elements that are coming into play soon in the next month or so with this that are very, very, very exciting that, as a listener, I would love.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can't wait until we start that stuff.
All right, everyone. Thanks a lot for listening. We really appreciate it.